Today, let's dive into an artistic movement that basically declared war on reality itself. Seriously, it was a movement that looked at the world around us and said, you know what, the most important parts are the ones you can't even see. This is the story of the Symbolist Revolt. So, let me ask you this. Is the world that you can see and touch, is that all there is? Well, for a rebellious group of artists and writers back in the late 19th century, the answer was a huge no. They were absolutely convinced that something much, much deeper was hiding just beneath the surface of everyday life. And this really gets to the core of their whole mission. See, they were just tired of art that was basically a photograph, just copying the material world. Their goal was way bigger, way more ambitious. They wanted to paint the unpaintable, to write the unwritable, to somehow give shape to that massive, invisible universe inside our own heads.
Now, a movement like this doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It really started as a powerful pushback against the dominant culture of the time. You could call it a full-blown revolt against what they saw as a pretty shallow, materialistic version of reality.
So at the time, the art world was all about realism and naturalism. The goal was to capture the world in super fine objective detail, like a scientist. But the symbolists, they looked at that and thought it was a total creative dead end. So they did a complete 180, turning away from the external world to go exploring the internal one, that whole realm of ideals and big emotions and dreams. And thinkers like the poet Charles Baudelaire were leading the charge. They were pushing back against, well, the entire package of modernity. They just couldn't stand the cold, impersonal feeling of city life, the endless grind of industry and commerce, and this really boring idea that language was just a tool for labeling stuff in the material world.
Okay, so if they're rejecting the outside world, where do you go? Well, they went inward. Their radical solution was to explore that vast, totally uncharted territory of the human mind. So, the movement officially gets its name with Jean Moraes's manifesto in 1886. And here's the key. Symbolism was never about just describing a tree. Nope, it was about using the idea of a tree to make you feel something, loneliness or growth or even decay. They believed our world was just a shadow of some higher, more perfect reality, and symbols were the key to unlocking it.
The critic Arthur Symons really nailed their mission with this quote. He called it a revolt against art that only ever shows you the surface, a revolt against language that sounds fancy but is actually empty, and a revolt against a tradition that valued things more than thoughts.
All right, so we know what they wanted to do, but how in the world did they actually pull it off? Let's take a look at the very specific tools and techniques they came up with to try and capture the invisible. And their toolkit was pretty revolutionary. First, instead of direct description, they used suggestion. They wouldn't say, the character was sad. Instead, they describe a gloomy, rainy landscape to make you, the reader, feel that sadness yourself. The goal wasn't to show you the world, it was to put you in a certain state of mind. They even treated poetry like music, focusing on the sounds and rhythms of words to create an emotional vibe that went way beyond just their literal meaning.
And this led them to this really fascinating idea, which Baudelaire called synesthesia. It's this concept of correspondences between our senses. You know, like when someone talks about a loud color or a sweet sound. It's that crossing of the wires. The symbolists thought these sensory crossovers were actual pathways to a deeper, more unified reality. Pretty cool, right?
But then, the poet Stéphane Mallarmé took things a step further with an idea that is genuinely mind-bending. He argued that words don't just point to things that already exist out there. For him, a poem wasn't a sign of reality. A poem helped create reality. The poet was a creator, not just a reporter. The very act of putting words on a page could literally bring a new reality into being. So, as you can imagine, this totally radical approach to art led to an equally radical philosophy about its purpose, or maybe its supposed lack of purpose.
L'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. This phrase became their rallying cry, and while it had been floating around since the philosopher Victor Cousin coined it in 1818, boy did the symbolists adopt it with a passion.
This idea falls under a doctrine called aestheticism, and what it means is that art doesn't need to teach you a lesson. It doesn't need to improve society or make a political point. Its only job, its only justification, is to be beautiful. This was a massive challenge to the whole Victorian idea that art had to be useful or morally good.
One of the movement's biggest critics, Remy de Gourmont, put it pretty bluntly. He said that great art has to be subjective. It has to be a pure expression of the artist's inner world. To be objective and impersonal? In his view, that was the very definition of being mediocre.
Now here's the thing. The official Symbolist movement itself didn't last all that long, but its ideas, they were anything but short-lived. They didn't just fade away. They basically planted all the seeds for the massive artistic revolutions of the 20th century.
And ironically, the people who had the most lasting influence were the movement's precursors, guys like Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, and Mallarmé. Their wild explorations laid the groundwork for decades of innovation, long after the official symbolism label had kind of fizzled out.
I mean, just look at this list. The movement's influence reads like a who's who of literary modernism. You've got the stream of consciousness style in James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, the myth-making of W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, that symbolist focus on our inner worlds, and the sheer creative power of language became absolutely central to their work. They completely changed the game.
So, at the end of the day, while some critics back then might have just dismissed the whole thing as decadent or self-indulgent, symbolism's impact is just undeniable. It wasn't just another art movement. It was a real philosophical shift that challenged our most basic ideas about what art is for, and maybe even what reality is. Which leaves us with one last thought to chew on. Remember Mallarmé's idea that poetry could help create reality? Well, if we accept that, if we believe that the stories we tell and the art we make don't just reflect the world, but actually help shape it, then what does that say about all the art, all the media, all the content that we're all creating and consuming right now? It's a pretty powerful question to think about.